In April of 2024, I moved to Tokyo to attend Japanese language school, after preparing and studying Japanese on my own for about 3 years. If 4 years ago Josh had the chance to interview me with what I know now, I think there's a lot of questions he would want to ask. Today I've gathered the questions up into categories so that hopefully, if some of these are questions you've had, you can learn something from my experience. If you've also experimented with different areas of language learning, or you visited Tokyo for the purpose of learning Japanese, definitely let me know in the comments below if you have any suggestions that I missed. Big picture questions. Why did you decide to move to Japan, and how did you know it was the right time? When I initially started studying Japanese, I actually didn't have a goal of moving to Japan. At the time, I was just interested in the language learning aspect, and that was probably true for at least the first 6 months of my language learning journey. At that point, I started to realize that the Japanese culture and Japanese language were very closely tied, and the more I learned about Japanese culture, the more I realized how incredible of an opportunity it would be to get to study Japanese in Japan so that I could understand this language that I was falling in love with within the context of the culture where it was created. I had also long held a separate goal of moving to another country in order to pick up some new lenses through which I might see the world. I'd grown up entirely within the scope of one culture, and while I've thought a lot about the ways that I view the world and what I want to do with my life, I recognize that that was from a fairly limited point of view. And so I had always hoped to one day be able to move to another country to expand that. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I could combine these two goals down into one and move to Japan to study Japanese, while learning a new set of lenses through which to see the world. How long did you spend preparing for the move to Japan? This is probably something that's different for everybody, but for me, I actually needed quite a bit of time to prepare for such a big move. I wanted to study Japanese up to a level where I would be able to really benefit from my time in Japan. And I also needed to save up some money so that I could focus on studying while I was in Japan and not have to worry so much about making ends meet in the meantime. I did some research on YouTube and through a couple organizations, including one called Nihon, which I'm sure I'll talk about a lot during this video. And I concluded that the best timeline for me would be to set out a 3-year plan for my move to Japan. During that time, I would study Japanese and try and see how far I could progress on my own and with online teachers. At the same time, I would prepare for the move and begin the process of finding and applying for a language school in Japan. Did you follow a specific roadmap or timeline to get ready? I found some other language learners on YouTube who had made a move to Japan themselves, whether it was to study Japanese or to pursue a different creative goal. And based on the answers they had about their experience during the move and some recommendations they made, I decided I was going to use Nihon as one of my main resources for finding a language school and housing, and that also helped in defining what my roadmap was for moving to Japan. Nihon is a free service that helps international students find language schools in Japan, also helps with preparing the documentation needed for your student visa and the school application process. A lot of those documents are really specific and they have to be done in Japanese, and so having an intermediary who can help with that was incredibly valuable. Nihon will accept applications at specific time windows for specific school start dates. So what I did was I planned to start applying at the earliest window for the start date I wanted, which was going to be the beginning of the school year in 2024. That meant I could start applying in the spring of 2023, and working backwards from there, that gave me about 2 years to save up money and start building up my own Japanese language knowledge in order to prepare for the move. What were your biggest fears or unknowns before the move? For me personally, I had made a similar but not international move when I went to attend university. I moved from Chicago to Oregon without ever having visited first. And through that experience, I was able to grow in ways that I never anticipated. Reflecting back on that as I was beginning my process of preparing for the move to Japan, I tried to set a similar expectation for myself. I knew there were a lot of things I could plan for ahead of time, but also I knew that if I was going to really get the most out of this experience to learn from a different culture from within inside the culture, that I was going to have to also allow space for there to be large unknowns and things that would change after I got to Japan that I couldn't anticipate ahead of time. With that mindset, there wasn't really anything large that I was worrying about before the move, but I will say that I spent a great deal of time trying to line up some really specific parts of doing the move. So if you're interested in moving to Japan, one thing I'm sure you'll run into in your research is that there's lots of little everyday life things that you'll need to set up, like a cell phone and a bank account and housing. And a lot of those kind of need the other one in order to exist. Like you need a cell phone number to get a bank account, and you need a bank account to get an apartment. So I think I spent a fair amount of time sort of just preparing to make sure I could do those in the right order and I wouldn't get stuck missing something at a key moment. I will say, reflecting back, that I built that up to be something that it didn't really have to be. These days you can get a Japanese cell phone number just as an eSIM online fairly affordably right before your trip to Japan. There's the JP Post Bank, which you can get an account with without having lived in Japan for very long, which is really handy. And I ended up using homestay as my main housing while I was in Japan, and I didn't actually need a specific bank account for that. So I spent some time worrying about the order of getting those together, and it turned out to not really be a big deal. The other thing I kind of worried about was my Japanese language level. One thing I've heard people say when traveling to other countries where there are people who speak English in that country is, oh, you'll be fine. There's English speakers. People will be able to help you. And I think now, having been to a few countries where English isn't the native language, I don't like that assumption for myself when I travel. I find that it's much better to have a language level that will make sure that I can get where I need to go and communicate with the people around me. In Japan, there are plenty of people who speak English. However, depending on what town you're in, just who's around you and what the situation is, you may find yourself in places where there are not very many English speakers or where you have to communicate in Japanese. In preparing for my move and working on increasing my Japanese language level, I attempted several different study routines, and some of them included using frequency dictionaries to learn vocabulary based on how commonly it's used in writing or in speech. Those turned out to be really helpful because when I landed in Japan, I actually could already understand a lot of the everyday Japanese that I needed, for example, to navigate the airport and the taxi to my first homestay family. Money and financial preparation. How much money did you save before moving, and how did you come up with that target? I get questions like this one quite a bit, and I think it's because folks know this is really important. I actually have an interest in personal finance, which helped, I think, with this process. If you're working on a big international move and you don't actually know a very specific breakdown of what your cost of living is and what you spend on different categories, I think that's an important first step to get a hang of. There's an author named Ramit Sethi who has a book that goes through a process of sort of automating your finances and tracking your spending. And I found that to be really helpful early on when I was learning about personal finance. But as I was planning for my move to Japan, I did some research on what the cost of living would be in Tokyo, where I wanted to live. Gogo Nihon actually has a cost of living calculator on their website, and I found those numbers to be pretty reasonable. I actually took their number and then increased it a little bit to be more conservative, and that ended up being the right choice for my time in Japan. You can certainly prioritize saving money while you're in Tokyo and make the most of the difference between maybe your home currency and the currency in Japan. But Tokyo is one of the more expensive cities in Japan, probably the most expensive city in Japan. And so if you don't want to have to pinch every penny, then you can end up spending as much living in Tokyo as you might in like a medium cost city in the US. So based on my budget and what I knew I spent on my American cost of living, what I did was I saved up 2 years of expenses, and that was what I had prepared before my move to Japan. I wasn't sure whether I was going to attend school for 1 or 2 years, which was the reason for this number. And in the end, it turned out to be basically exactly the right amount. I only used about half of it, and I stayed in Japan for a year. What categories ended up being more expensive than you expected? In Japan, a lot of people live in smaller apartments compared to the area that I live in the United States. And so a lot of folks have smaller kitchens and end up eating out more. Especially compared to Chicago, where I live, eating out in Japan is much more affordable. But even with the difference in the cost of eating out, I did spend more on eating out with friends when I was in Japan than I anticipated. That ended up being okay because I spent less in some other areas like groceries, but it's something to keep in mind if you are planning to eat out with friends from school or from work as, a way to socialize and get to experience the great food culture in Tokyo. Maybe save up a little extra for that so that it's not something you have to worry about. Did you set aside any emergency funds before moving to Japan? For my move to Japan, I wasn't sure how long I was going to be there, so there were a couple categories of emergency funds that I did actually save up ahead of time. One of those was a fund for if I had to move back to the States to make sure I had sort of a cushion of time to find a new job again. And the other one was for medical expenses. Now, when I was in Japan, I did actually use the healthcare system several times, and it was very different from what we have here in the US. The cost especially is very different. As someone who's living in Japan for more than 3 months, you get to enroll in the national healthcare system. You do have to pay premiums for that, but it's based on your income. So if you're a student or you're working part-time, it's not very expensive. And the quality of care was very high, especially considering that the cost was so much lower. So I didn't actually end up having to use my medical emergency savings at all, even though I went to several doctors while I was in Japan. And that was a pleasant surprise. What's one financial step you're really glad you did? When I moved to Japan, I became a student full-time for the first time since graduating university. I was a little bit unsure how that would feel and whether the stress of knowing I didn't have new money coming in would be something that sort of took away from my experience. Having saved up enough money for my entire time in Japan, plus a cushion in case I had to return to the United States, I think really helped with that. That said, I did have a lot of classmates who worked part-time jobs while they were in school. It seemed like that did add some stress, but it also had advantages as well because they got to practice the Japanese we were learning in class in realistic everyday scenarios with their coworkers and with customers. So that's also an option if you're not in a position to save up before you move to Japan. It's worth knowing that part-time jobs don't make a lot of money, so you may not be able to count on that for all of your living and school expenses while you're in Japan, but it can be an option to help supplement some savings that you've put together ahead of time. Logistics and planning. How did you choose your language school and apply? I used Gogo Nihon to help find my language school and to help coordinate the process of applying. They work with several schools throughout Tokyo and the rest of Japan. And what I did was I lined up all the schools I was interested in on a spreadsheet and then added categories for the specific areas of study I wanted to focus in. For me, that was JLPT preparation as well as business Japanese and conversation practice. I found a few different schools that had the right combination of those and were in areas that I wanted to live, and I ran these schools by my Gogo Nihon coordinator who helped me narrow it down to the one I ended up picking. I picked a medium fast-paced school, which is one of the most important things to consider when you're choosing a language school, especially if you're going to do something like working a part-time job or you have friends in Japan you want to spend a lot of time with. Making sure the school pace matches the amount of effort you want to put into your time as a student in Japan is really important. For me, I knew that I was going to be living with homestay families, so that was going to take some of my time, but I really wanted the rest of the time to be focused on studying, which is why I picked a slightly more intense language school. Looking back now, I'm really glad that I picked such a fast-paced language school because it pushed me way farther than I thought I could have gotten in a year. What was the visa process like and how long did it take? Applying for a student visa is something that you can do on your own, and you can also just do it working directly with your language school. I wasn't quite sure of what all would be involved, and so I used Gogo Nihon for the entire process. That was actually pretty helpful because they had this set form where they could collect information from me Then they helped work with the school to make sure the school had all the paperwork they needed. And then the school got me my certificate of eligibility, which I used to apply from the States here to get my student visa. I started applying for language school about a year before I wanted to attend school, which is the earliest that Gogo Nihon will accept applications. It may also be the earliest that some schools accept applications as well. But even with starting that early, we ended up waiting closer towards my move date to actually submit for a visa. Even when you get your certificate of eligibility, it still takes a little while to get a visa. So it was a little bit stressful towards the end, just knowing that there was technically things that could go wrong and my visa could get delayed. So the fact that it went all the way till the last 2 weeks before I was moving to Japan was a little nerve-wracking, but I think that's just the standard procedure because you don't need your visa earlier than that, and they don't want people getting a visa and starting it too early because then your visa will run out before your school program finishes. You can extend a student visa, but my understanding is that a student visa for language school specifically can only be 2 years at maximum, and that's a lifetime maximum for you as a student. So for example, if you enrolled in a 2-year program and they gave you your visa really early and you went over there early, I think you could technically start using your visa, but then when your 2 years ran out, you'd have a bit of your last semester left that wasn't covered by your visa and you'd have to leave. So that's my understanding, is that that's what they're trying to avoid. What paperwork did you need before leaving? I read a lot of resources online about the different kinds of official paperwork I might need, and this is one area where I think I definitely over-prepared. I went back and gathered any kind of legal document I could think of, whether it was birth certificates, copies of transcripts and graduation certificates, all those sort of things. And I'm glad I did. I think everybody should, get a handle on that stuff when they have a chance to. But apart from my initial visa application, there was never a point where I needed some specific documentation from the States that I hadn't prepared ahead of time. So that ended up being a bit of extra preparation. How did you book your flight and choose a date? Gogo Nihon helped with this process as well, in that they explained to me that I would want to be sure to arrive only a few days before my school program started so that my visa would cover my entire time in school. With that in mind, I just booked a flight for the weekend before school started, which gave me a couple days of leeway before our first day of class, and that ended up working out perfectly fine. Did you have to cancel or pause anything before leaving the States, like insurance or subscriptions? I had kind of a unique situation in that my partner actually stayed here in the apartment, so I didn't have to wrap up my US apartment. I did close out some things like driver's insurance and stuff that I couldn't use while I was in Japan. One thing that I hadn't really thought through is that I'm a Apple user, and your Apple ID is tied to a specific region, and so all of my subscriptions through Apple, like for music and things, are tied to my US Apple ID. And there were a few times when I kind of wished I had a Japanese Apple ID while I was in Japan. There are banking apps and points apps that you can't really use with an American region Apple ID that you need a Japanese region Apple ID for. So looking back, that's something I would consider. If my partner and I get to go to Japan again, that's something we will also talk through. Perhaps either using like an old phone to make a Japan Apple ID and then use that for the points and banking and things. Something like that might be a good idea that I would consider for next time. How did you decide what to pack versus buy in Japan? I made a whole video about this at the time, but I actually went through an entire phase of really trimming down my travel equipment before moving to Japan. I found new clothes that I could use for multiple things, which would enable me to fit all of my luggage in just the carry-on and checked bags I was allowed on the airlines. This ended up being really helpful because while I was staying with homestay families, when a family had like a trip or something come up, Homestay in Japan, the company I was going through, helped me move to join a new family. And when I moved between families, I was really glad that I could fit all my stuff inside just enough luggage to ship between houses. That ended up making the process of moving much less stressful. And I was really thankful that I put the time in ahead of time. That said, if you don't move as much, like I had some friends who just lived in the same apartment their entire time in Japan, and they ended up bringing some luggage, but then buying the rest of their stuff in Japan. There's certainly enough shops that you can get clothes and furniture when you're in Japan and keep that in your apartment. That's definitely another way to do it. You don't have to spend as much time researching minimalist travel as I did before moving. What were the most useful things you brought? When I started school, I had to buy some school supplies, but apart from that, there wasn't really anything specific that I needed in Japan that I hadn't brought with me, which was a pleasant surprise. So all of my clothes worked well for the really hot Tokyo summer, and I brought a bunch of camera gear, which was really fun to use going on photography adventures with friends. And all of my travel stuff worked for the adventures I did while I was in Japan, including going on hikes, visiting other cities. So I was really glad that I invested in high quality stuff that was easy to move around with me before I came to Japan. But I don't know that there was any one piece that particularly made my time in Japan work out well. But I do think that having kind of a capsule wardrobe really set up before I arrived was helpful, because I never really had to stop to figure out what clothes to buy or what to wear, and that made it a lot easier. I will say that depending on what toiletries you use and what clothes you wear, there may be some things that you can't find in Japan that you can only get in your home country. For me, that was, deodorant in Japan is a little different than what they have in the States here. Toothbrush sizes. So for some reason, like if you just go to a grocery store and buy a toothbrush, it looks like half the size of the toothbrushes we have in the United States. And then also the toothpaste is a bit different than what we have here. I'm also much taller, so I wear shoes that are a size you can't really just walk into a store and get in Japan. So when my partner came out to Japan to visit, those were the things I asked her to bring, like toothbrushes, deodorant, toothpaste, shoes. And so depending on what you use, you might run into something like that as well. And it's worth just doing some quick research online. Likely other people have run into it as well. And so you'll find recommendations for what to bring, a little extra of before your move. What did you bring that you didn't need? The winters in Tokyo and Chicago are quite different. So I actually brought a little bit more winter gear than I ended up needing in Tokyo. It was like 80 degrees Fahrenheit all the way into October. So it was in a whole different category than winter in Chicago. And I think I could have saved a little bit of packing space by bringing a little less winter stuff. But that said, there's certainly places in Japan that have winters like Chicago. So just do a little research ahead of time for the climate of what area you're moving to in Japan. Housing and living setup. How did you choose between homestay, share house, and apartment for your housing? When I was researching a move to Japan, I actually considered all three of these kinds of housing. Homestay had the advantage of getting to speak Japanese with native Japanese speakers every day around the house. Having my own apartment would have the advantage of being able to kind of set my own schedule and have my own space to return to at the end of the day. And share house actually is the most affordable, or at least the ones I looked at were more affordable than the homestay and apartment options. In the end, I ended up picking homestay because my main goal in moving to Japan was language and culture immersion. And I knew myself enough to know that if I had my own space in an apartment, I wouldn't push myself to study quite as hard to make up for that difference in opportunity to speak Japanese. Most of my friends in school actually had their own apartments, and that seemed to work well for them. Some folks also did share house as well, which can be cool because you end up living with just folks from the community, not just other language students. So you can make a lot of friends that way and also have opportunities to speak Japanese. It does depend who you're living with, though. You might end up living with folks who aren't interested in that kind of interaction, so it's a bit hit or miss from my understanding. I did homestay through a company called Homestay in Japan, and that was incredibly helpful because they actually coordinated with the homestay families to help pick a family that would be the right fit for what I was looking for. I was specifically looking for families who spoke Japanese around the house so that I could get more language exposure and so that it would push me in my everyday speaking abilities. Having a company like Homestay in Japan to sort of coordinate the process is extra helpful because if you do end up with a family that's maybe not quite as good of a fit, or if a family only has a limited length of time they can have you for, then there's a coordinator who you trust who can help line up the next family and make sure you're somewhere where you can get what you're hoping for out of the experience. What was the homestay application process like? Once I selected a language school, Gogo Nihon actually connected me with Homestay in Japan and helped with filling out the initial application. They just looked for things like what would be most important to you, for example, commute time, opportunity to speak Japanese, whether a family had children or not, that sort of thing. It wasn't hard to apply, and the coordinator I had the chance to work with at Homestay in Japan was really friendly and easy to work with, so it made the whole process really smooth. Did you know your homestay families ahead of time? Homestay in Japan helps match folks with homestay families, but you don't actually get a chance to meet the family ahead of time. So it was mostly a matter of communicating clearly with my homestay coordinator what it was I was looking for, and then they went ahead and found an available family who matched those descriptions. It was really fun because as a result, I got to stay with families who had kids, families whose kids had already left the house, families of different ages and backgrounds, and everybody lives and speaks a little bit differently, and so having that variety of experience was incredibly valuable. What preparation did you do to adjust to living with a homestay family? My partner and I don't have kids, so that was maybe the biggest area of adjustment in moving in with a homestay family. A lot of the families I lived with did have younger kids, but I found that it was not hard to adjust after the initial period of moving to Japan. In part, that's because my language level was still entry level enough that kids, even like preschool level kids, that was like the exact level of communication I could do. And so I ended up having a great time meeting all the homestay families and getting to play with kids at different ages. And it's just a different kind of language experience than you get by just talking to people your own age or doing homework for school or things like that. I didn't do any specific preparation to get ready for homestay families other than practicing Japanese as much as I could before my move, so that I would be able to communicate kind of my everyday needs and talk with them about the expectations of living in their house and things like that. Did you send any kind of introduction letter or gift? I believe Homestay in Japan actually did help me write kind of an introduction letter, which all of my homestay families got to see when they were deciding whether I would be a good fit for them. And when I moved between homestay families, I also took the time to write thank you letters in Japanese to each family and to prepare some omiyage for the next family I was going to live with. That's kind of a cultural tradition in Japan. It doesn't have to be an expensive gift, and usually it's best to pick something that people will use up, whether that's just like cookies, or in summer you can get these little towels that people carry with them because it's so hot outside. Things like that. It doesn't have to be something big, but preparing that ahead of time kind of shows an intentionality and a respect for your new host family before you move in. Tech and admin. What apps or tools did you install ahead of time? This was one area where I had a lot to learn after moving to Japan. I had gotten really used to using tools like Google Maps in Chicago to navigate public transit systems, for example. And a lot of those tools are built in the US, and so they're not quite as fully featured in Japan. Especially when my partner came out to visit over summer vacation and we went to Hakone, we found that Google Maps kind of fell short on bus and train schedules once you get outside of Tokyo. So having a couple Maps apps to use is certainly helpful. Another thing is that there were a few transit apps that people who live in Japan use, which seemed to be even more helpful than just using the American tech company map apps. And so that's something that's worth researching. They are a little bit different depending on whether you use Android or iPhone, but I think if you just poke around real quick and see what transit apps people use in the specific area you're going to be going to, that can be really helpful. A lot of times the apps are written in Japanese, like the real transit apps, but that can be a great excuse to learn some transit vocabulary before you go. In terms of language apps, the most valuable app that I use the most on my phone is Shirabe Jisho, which is an iOS app that I believe uses the API from jisho.org, the dictionary website. I like that app because you can write in kanji, and so it can be helpful for looking things up on the fly. When I moved to Japan, at that time, I hadn't really invested a lot in learning how to use AI tools. I will say that by the time I left Japan, I was using ChatGPT a fair amount, both for planning trips and researching things I didn't know about. It's certainly not a drop-in for knowing the Japanese language, though. There's a lot of context that goes into Japanese communication, so I think translation tools and AI tools can certainly be really helpful, and one part of the way you navigate daily life in a country with a different language, but they don't replace knowing the language yourself. Did you unlock your phone or get a SIM card in advance? As a matter of habit, I actually do buy unlocked phones in the States because I like to switch to whichever carrier works best where I'm living or can give me the best rate. So I did have an unlocked phone when I moved to Japan, and I did get a plan through a company I think called Mobile. There's several carriers that offer plans to tourists and people moving to Japan, so it's worth doing a little bit of research. Some of them have not as good reputations. I had a great experience with the one I used, but a lot of my friends used different ones and also had good experiences. So these days you can get an eSIM, which you can activate directly upon landing in Japan, and it all just works right out of the box, which is great. So it's worth doing research ahead of time, but it's really easy to do once you figure out which carrier you want to go with. How did you set up your banking in Japan? I used JP Post Bank in Japan. I think there's another name too. When people ask about it in Japanese, that's not the name they use, but it's through the postal service, and you can set up an account with them even right after landing in Japan. A lot of the more formal banks require you to have been living in Japan for 6 months before you can open an account, and even then some of them have other requirements. I had friends who were able to set up accounts with big name banks in Japan with no problem, and others who also ran into some barriers. So your mileage may vary there, but you can set up a JP Post Bank account right away. And I found them really easy to work with, and it was helpful for like paying my health insurance premiums and things like that along the way. I didn't have to use the bank account for any part-time job things or rent, so it might be that there's a different kind of account you would need for that. But I would say it's worth having some kind of bank account so that you can connect it to your home bank account and work with transferring money between the two. When it comes to money transfers, I used a company called Wise, which was pretty easy to use. They give you a card and you can use it in ATMs, and then you can connect Wise to your American bank accounts and then connect the other half of it to your Japanese bank account. I liked it because it showed me the exact fees I was going to pay before transferring money from US dollars to yen, so it felt like I wasn't getting scammed out of anything, which is pretty helpful. I didn't end up needing cash as often as I thought I would. I think more and more vendors and even my school while I was there moved from bank transfers and cash only to accepting cards and digital payment methods. So I think that's continuing to improve over time. And it seemed like cash was necessary for everyday life, but not as much as I had heard before moving there. How did you prepare to manage taxes and insurance and things like that when moving to Japan? So when you live in Japan, you have to sign up for national pension and health insurance, national health insurance. You do pay premiums for both of those, but if you're not making an income and you're a full-time student like I was, you can apply through the city office to get an exemption from having to pay for pension and to get a discount on your national health insurance premiums, which was really helpful. So those are things you have to kind of know that you have to fill out depending on which city I was living in. Sometimes they would help ask if I needed those things, but some cities didn't. So it's worth knowing. And it's something that my language school was also really helpful in informing me about and helping coordinate. But there are discounts you can get if you are working part-time or a student. And I did end up doing those. Every time I moved, I had to re-register with the city I was living in and fill out that kind of paperwork again. The city office also has tax services and people who can answer questions about taxes. And so that was who I went to when I had questions. I didn't actually earn any income in Japan, so I didn't end up having to pay taxes, but I did have to file some paperwork indicating that I was a student during the year I lived there. And they were really helpful in helping get all that together and make sure I had filled out the right paperwork. Language prep. What was your Japanese language level before moving? I self-studied for about 3 years before moving to Japan, and the December before I moved, I passed the JLPT N4. I was probably being a little conservative in which level test I took because after moving, I was able to pass the N3 in just a few months in July, so probably somewhere between N4 and N3 level when I left. I will say that the year before I moved, I listened to probably literally thousands of hours of Japanese podcasts, and that was incredibly helpful for boosting my listening level. My thought process at the time was that I was kind of having trouble increasing my vocabulary at the pace I had hoped I would. But I thought if I could at least understand what my teachers and what folks around me were saying, then I'd be able to communicate to the best of my ability given the grammar and vocabulary that I had. And that ended up being true. I was really thankful that I had invested so much in listening skills ahead of time. I think having that head start actually carried me through the entire year of language school and enabled me to take classes that were maybe slightly harder than I would have been able to otherwise. And that in turn was what helped me make as much progress as I did while I was in Japan. By the time I left Japan, I was able to pass the JLPT N2. JLPT levels aren't the same thing as proficiency, but it's one way to indicate your reading and listening level. So I was able to make quite a bit of progress while I was in Japan, and I think a lot of that was thanks to the preparation I did ahead of time that I was able to leverage to learn other areas of Japanese while I was in Japan. Did you practice speaking Japanese with anyone before moving to Japan? In the probably all 3 years of my self-study, I did actually work with tutors on italki, and that was really helpful for working on my speaking ability. When I landed in Japan, though, that was definitely my lowest area of proficiency in terms of everyday Japanese, and it took quite a bit to be comfortable just jumping into everyday conversations. Part of that, though, is just being comfortable, or rather getting used to the level of discomfort that you feel jumping into a conversation in a language that's not your native language. I think once I was able to get over that barrier, I found my language level began to progress much faster than it was before. And that was simply because I was getting into more conversations in Japanese and kind of just jumping in whether I knew where it was going to go or not. And I think that was really helpful. I could have definitely done more of that in the States before moving to Japan. And my classmates who had a really high speaking level were definitely able to navigate everyday life much more smoothly than I was. So that's an area that's definitely worth investing in. And you don't need to be in Japan to do it by any means. I think it's just a matter of practicing enough that you get used to the feeling of jumping into a conversation that may be difficult and may have parts you don't understand, but pushing through and working together with the person you're speaking with to both understand what you're trying to communicate. How did you build Japanese language confidence before moving to Japan? I think the most important thing in studying a language that's going to take a long time to learn, so one that's very different from your native language, is finding a study approach that's fun or interesting enough that you can keep doing it for a long time. For me, I really like listening to podcasts and audiobooks in English. And so I identified that early on as an area that I might put some extra effort into in Japanese because it was already fun for me. Listening to audiobooks and especially podcasts in Japanese ended up pushing my listening level way above my other language proficiency levels. And I was able to leverage that to help increase my other areas of Japanese, like speaking and writing and vocabulary, because as you get better at listening, you start to understand more words, or at least your brain is kind of prepared for those words when you hear them for the first time. Also being able to understand what people are saying, even if you don't necessarily know how to express all of your thoughts in response to that, is really valuable because you can make friends in Japanese. You can get around in everyday life, follow instructions and things like that. But that worked for me because I was already interested in those areas in my native language. If somebody, for example, really likes reading books, maybe that would be their strength that they could lean into ahead of time and get really good at reading in Japanese. Or if somebody just is very social and likes talking to people, maybe speaking would be the area they would lean into first. I think finding the area where you already have an interest and trying to see if that is a way you can progress a little faster in one proficiency area is a great way to do it. Mindset and culture. How did you mentally prepare to live in a new culture? Before moving to Japan, I had been listening to a lot of native Japanese podcasts, and so I had some idea of what was different in terms of what people did every day and what people talked about with their friends compared to what I do here in Chicago. I also did plenty of research about Japanese culture in general, reading books and watching documentaries. I think I read some history books too. And all of that helped get me maybe a third of the way there. The rest, I think I learned after arriving in Japan. What helped you get used to living in a new culture? After moving to Japan, there were a bunch of things that were different than the culture I lived in the States, obviously. It was everything from like little everyday interactions to bigger picture things in terms of like family culture and business culture. And at the time, I had discovered a couple books which really helped with the process of sort of coming to terms with living in a culture that was so different than the one I grew up in. One of those was Adam Grant's Think Again, which is a book specifically about continuously transforming the way you think over your lifetime and being open to new experiences and new ways of thinking. That was the first one I read and a really great gateway into what ultimately led to me finally getting a grasp on maybe that last 2/3 of Japanese culture, which was very different from what I could have even prepared for from the States. After that book, I read a couple more, which I've talked about in other videos. One of them was The Righteous Mind, and there's a couple other ones in there. And just like I think the important part of all of that was knowing that it was going to take a lot of intentional effort on my part to understand a new culture and that it wasn't something that was just going to come for free because I lived in Japan. Starting off on that foot helped me not get stuck when I hit the point of things I didn't understand in daily life or when we're learning business Japanese at school. So I think it's important to keep an open mind and to find ways to encourage yourself to ask questions about the way you learned things should be done, to be curious about things that are different than your expectations, rather than just closing yourself off and limiting your worldview to what you came to Japan with, because I think there's a lot of interesting things you can learn from Japanese culture, no matter where you came from. And I'm certainly glad that I was able to take that approach because I feel like I got a lot more out of my experience of living in Japan as a result. One specific example of that is the way that American culture and Japanese culture thinks about the smallest unit of importance when making decisions just in daily life. So in the States, the individual is definitely the smallest unit of importance. We think it's important that people should be able to live the lives that they specifically personally want to live. And we make laws and go to protests and things when that's not the case. And that's what our culture is very much built around. In Japan, the culture is built around the idea that the smallest unit of importance changes depending on context. So there certainly are contexts where it's still the individual, but there's also times when it's something bigger than that, like the family or the company where you work or even the city you live in. This is even reflected in the Japanese language itself. There are different verbs for giving and receiving depending on who's receiving something. And when you use a verb like morao, it's you yourself receiving something, but that you is this smallest unit of importance. So it could be your family. You could use that same word if your sister received something because she's another version of you in the context of your family. And you'll even see it used like if your city received something like recognition from another city or another country, you could still use that same verb because it's you, but in that context, the smallest unit of importance is your city. That sounds really specific, but it actually kind of trickles out into a lot of aspects of everyday life and business culture in Japan. People have different work culture as a result. People prioritize the group belonging at work in a different way than they do in the States. And people prioritize the needs of those groups in a different way than they do in the States, where the individual is always seen as more important than the group that they're a part of. Final countdown. What did you do in the last week before moving? As I got ready to move to Japan, I did several test packs of all my luggage. I only brought enough stuff to fit into the checked and carry-on luggage that you could fit on the airplane, so I had to really prioritize what I was bringing and leaving. I also ended up donating a bunch of stuff, and my partner helped me scan like a bunch of old documents and yearbooks and things that I couldn't bring with me. The last week was definitely getting to go on some final Chicago adventures while I was still here and getting ready to leave. What was the biggest last-minute stressor or surprise? Even though I started the visa application process well ahead of time, like I started applying for school as early as I could, a year before my start date, I think I had my last visa to do item where I had to drop some paperwork off at the embassy here. I think that was in the last week before leaving, or 2 weeks before leaving, and I didn't get my actual visa until the last week. So that did feel like that came down to the wire, even though I did everything by the deadline I was supposed to. I think that's normal though, but that was maybe the most stressful thing about the last week before leaving. And what was it like finally arriving in Japan? I landed in Japan in the evening of April 1st, and the plan was to go directly to my homestay family that day. I had prepared my phone ahead of time, but I had missed some fine print that when you went to activate your SIM card, there was like potentially a 3-hour delay. So I activated it when I landed and went through customs, but the SIM card didn't actually finish activating by the time I needed to call my homestay family. Luckily, before I left the US, I had switched my US carrier to Google Fi, which has pretty good international coverage on their plans. So I was able to use my Google Fi number to get 4G in the airport. And then there's an app called Line that people use for messaging in Japan. And I used that to contact my homestay family. The ride from the airport to my homestay family was just a taxi, and that was actually something that Gogo Nihon helped coordinate. It's a little expensive to do that, but with all my luggage, it was definitely helpful to have somebody for my first time in Japan to help navigate the process of getting from the airport to where I lived. But my homestay family was very welcoming. They helped me lug all my stuff inside, and I think they even made supper for me that first night, even though I landed super late. And yeah, it was a great way to kick off the time in Japan. That smell of spring in Tokyo still, I think, will always bring back that memory of the first time landing there. It's different than anything else I'd experienced and still feels like exciting and motivating when it came around this spring as well. Thanks for joining me today. That was really fun to answer all those questions. If you have any questions about my time in Japan or the process of preparing to move to Japan, definitely let me know in the comments and I will try to help out however I can. I look forward to seeing you all next time.